Hi, and welcome to Ant's Cricket Shorts. In previous episodes, I've covered South African cricket before and after Apartheid. And as the South African tour of Australia draws to a close, I thought it appropriate that my final episodes in my South African series should be the things that went on in between. As we learnt before, South Africa were booted out of international cricket in 1970. That's not to say international cricket stayed out of South Africa. In the summer of 1971-72, the New Zealand women toured South Africa for a 3-test series, coming away 1-0 victors. In 1971, a new rule regarding race and sport in South Africa was implemented. South African athletes could compete against athletes of a different race in events declared international. This would allow South Africa to compete in events such as the Davis Cup. This did not extend to the local or regional level. Although this was seen for what it was by most of the international sporting community, the Davis Cup did allow readmission, and the South Africans won in 1974 following an Indian boycott of the final. Starting in the summer of 72-73, English cricket promoter Derek Robins would tour D.H. Robins 11 each summer until 1976. As there was no penalty for players touring South Africa, these teams would include many test players. The first tour, made up of all Englishmen, included Jackie Hampshire, John Lever, Peter Wiley and Bob Willis. The effectively representative South African team won both the 4-day match and the 1-day match played at the end of the tour. From the second tour onwards, the team gathered a more international flavour. Captained by English Test player Brian Close, the team also included Australian Test players Bruce Francis and John Gleeson, Indian-born South African who played Test cricket for England Bob Woolmer, and perhaps most notably Pakistani international Yunus Ahmed and West Indian John Shepherd. This time there were 3 4-day games, resulting in 2 draws and a win for the South Africans, and a 1-day game that the tourists won. In 1974, the policy of mixed-race sport was expanded, allowing for those sports that had been suspended by international bodies to hold multinational events. This would allow an all-white South African team to compete against an all-black team from one of the Bantustans, the territory set aside for people of colour as part of apartheid. As part of this move, sports that had been banned by the international organisations could receive tours of multiracial teams, which eased the tensions caused by Ahmed and Shepherd's inclusion in the second Robins 11. But again, this was largely for the consumption of the international audience. Ahmed and Shepherd were again on the close captain team for the March 1975 tour. Notable additions to this tour were Australian legend Max Walker and South African turned Englishman Tony Greig, seen here. The biggest surprise of this tour was that not only were there 2 players of colour on the touring team, but the South Africans also selected 2 black players, Edward Havani, seen here, and Cedric Conrad, who helped their team easily win both the first class and the 1-day matches. In early 1976, there were reports that full international tours by Australia might possibly be recommencing. Whilst in the West Indies, General Secretary of the Barbados Workers' Union, Frank Walcott, called for any player who had toured South Africa to be banned from playing in the West Indies. This would have implications for all cricketing nations. The 1976 tour had been an active attempt to foster multiracial cricket in South Africa by the South African administrators, although the government, who decreed that only an all-white team could refer to themselves as South Africa, resisted it. The final D.H. Robins 11 in January 76 was captained by David Bumble Lloyd and included English stalwarts Derek Randall and Fred Titmus, future Kiwi captain Jeff Howarth, and the youngest of the Chappell brothers, an experimental bowling expert Trevor. The South African Invitation 11, as it was known, included the black player Samson Sonwabi. This would be the last tour Robins took to South Africa, although he would continue to tour cricket teams around the world, including series in Australia, New Zealand, the West Indies, Sri Lanka, Hong Kong, Singapore and Canada, although none would have the star power of the South African tours. The South African government announced that individual sports could choose to pick mixed-race teams and that they could choose to have integrated crowds at the games. However, the clubs were to remain segregated. The South African Cricket Union had been created in 1976 to administer cricket on a multiracial basis. This was criticised as propaganda for international audiences. As a result, one match of the Robins 11 tour was cancelled due to protests from the body representing Asian South Africans, led by Dr. Abu Baker Asvat, calling for integration to happen at club level before it was promoted at the international level. Just a month later, Richie Benaud's International Wanderers landed for the last international tour of South Africa in the decade. John Shepherd once again made the trip, and Englishmen Derek Underwood, Bob Taylor, and Mike Dennis were joined by Kiwi Glenn Turner and Aussies Ian Chappell, Dennis Lilly, Ashley Mallett and Max Walker, amongst others, to make up the strongest team to tour South Africa in the 1970s. The South Africans, in return, picked their most multiracial team to date, with 6 non-white players getting a run for the Invitational 11 during the tour. The results was 1 win apiece, and a draw from the 3 4-day games, and a win to the tourists in the 1 one-day game. In June 1976, the Soweto uprising was put down with brutal force by the South African police, and in July 29, 29 countries, including all but 2 African nations, boycotted the Montreal Olympics as a protest against the All Blacks rugby tour of South Africa. This led to a UN committee being formed to draft the International Convention Against Apartheid in Sports, although in true UN efficiency, the draft for this convention would not be submitted until 1985. In 1977, the Glen Eagles Agreement was reached. In this, Commonwealth nations called on governments to discourage contact or competition of their sporting bodies with South African ones.